Following the advent of the computer and the sudden rise of personal computing device availability seen in the 80s, there was some degree of skepticism and fear towards what computers and subsequently the internet meant for mankind. It was a short-lived fear, obviously, but for a time in the 90s, explaining to someone that the internet existed as a separate background world to the visible one presented some sense of unease to people who had previously only existed in the singular world. We understand now that while the internet is not completely harmless, it isn't as ethereal as a threat as we believe. Movies like Ghost in the Shell or the Serial Experiments Lane series aim to capture the fear and explore hypothetical futures in which technology and man are much less distant. To a lesser extent, The Matrix also tried this, but while I do like The Matrix, it isn't really as clever in its exploration as it likes to think it is. Granted, the idea is cool and the film developed an iconic style that was imitated for years after the fact, but films like Ghost in the Shell went balls deep into the philosophy of transhumanism. Sometimes a little too deep in an area where it lost the point a little in how much bollocks it throws at you, but deep enough that it called into question the very nature of humanity's future at the hands of machines. Y2K, Operation Sun Devil, Cult of the Dead Crow, and Sandra Bullock, computers were still new and exciting, but also terrifying with very little boundaries, and Ghost in the Shell understood this perfectly. It took the hysteria of the digital age and threw in philosophy regarding identity, theological debate, and existentialism against the degrading backdrop of a neon Tokyo lookalike, choking under the weight of its own technological advancement. Add to that an outstanding score and an impeccable design, and you're left with a film that leaves a lasting impact on the viewer. Granted, it has lost its bite a little with regards to the knowledge we now have, but with technology continuing to advance, there may be a time where this film becomes just as relevant as it was in the 90s. Certainly more relevant than a remake will ever be, but I'm trying to make this not about the remake, I really am. Set in 2029 in a world where cybernetic enhancements are on vogue, and the internet is as much a physically integrated part of the body as it is a network, Ghost in the Shell explores the implications of being able to replace the human body like a living ship of Theseus, delving into the philosophy of the application of identity to something that can change being pretty much whenever it pleases. Apply this to the Major, a central protagonist that's gone full cyborg and is working for the Section 9 counter-terrorism group. Then you've got a recipe for some very deep analysis. The film follows the Major as a convoluted cyber-terrorism plot involving an elusive AI known as the Puppet Master, and some brain hacking, the implications which is still terrifying to consider as a human being, start to draw the attention of Section 9. What ensues is a mash of ghost-hack subjects, dead ends, megatech, and something called Project 2501, which coalesces into a climax that feels both satisfying and highly confusing upon first viewing. I benefit from having seen the movie multiple times over the course of several years, but if I was to review the movie from the perspective of someone who had never seen it before, I would probably have something to say about the organisation of the story. While it is an extremely clever plot that explores some really advanced philosophy, the narrative is not forgiving to new viewers. It features one very central character that only appears once in the opening and pretty much never again. They very barely allude to the Major's character story of being self-destructive towards a body that isn't hers. Granted, they explore this more in the series, but it makes the scuba diving scene make a lot more sense if you know that beforehand. And they routinely take part in giving long-winded exposition with no breaks in a way that feels slightly forced. I know it's for the benefit of the audience, but it feels a tad awkward whenever someone crowbars in a 12-page document of exposition. Aside from that, though, I can't really find much fault with the writing, though you could argue that at points this film feels like it's pretending to be smarter than it actually is. A bit like the scripts I write for these reviews. The writing is complemented massively by the voice acting, however. And yes, I do think the English dub was better than the Japanese version. I really don't think much is lost when you watch a dub unless it's particularly bad. In fact, the only anime I didn't watch with a dub was Grave of the Fireflies, because the acting fell apart so much that it hurt the emotional impact of the film. And yeah, part of it is because I'm a lazy monolingual prick with no effort towards reading all this shit. But I also don't really know how to judge foreign language acting sometimes, because I'm not familiar with the intonation. This goes for all subtitled films, not just anime. I will never watch a dubbed live action film though. It's always too awkward to see desynced speech in live action than it is in animation. With regards to the raw filmmaking, it's all on point. I've heard it said that the long shots are kind of obnoxious, but I've never felt that at all. The long shots are paced extremely well in a way that complements the astounding score behind it to create an atmosphere that can only be described as extremely unnerving. I don't know what it is with anime as a medium, but it seems to be able to nail the feeling that something in the background of the world you're seeing is very, very wrong in some way. Angel's Egg, by the same director, whose name I'm going to butcher later, is another film I'm trying to find an excuse to review that absolutely nails the atmosphere, even though the creator has agreed that the film literally makes no conceivable sense. The world of Ghost in the Shell is by all accounts fake. Fiberglass replaces skin and neon flies high in every street corner. Nothing is ever really completely human, and as such there is ground for some extremely unnerving shit to take place. One thing it likes to do is use fisheye lens effects for some reason. It sounds strange on paper, but in practice it creates a palpable sense of raw, unnerving fear. Also beagles. Beagles everywhere. With regards to the animation, movement and weight is another thing that it displays flawlessly. This is one thing that most animation seems to fall flat on. It's understandable if the team is less experienced or there isn't enough time of resources, but if there is one thing that irks me, it's floaty animation. I know the term floaty is trite and overused, but it's the only term applicable. It isn't quite Cowboy Bebop good, but it successfully captures the weight of every movement in a way that is realistic when it needs to be, but can switch into unnatural and exaggerated movements whenever cybernetics are being used. The film may suffer a slight scale problem, given that the set pieces seem to follow a slightly awkward downward spiral, starting the film with a near stratosphere skyscraper and ending in a disused pier attraction. Mamoru Oshii's directing style fucking nailed it, brings a shitload to the table, though there is plenty to study with regards to the base filmmaking. The shot composition is fairly standard throughout the film, but there are a number of shots that are absolutely astounding. There's some recurring motifs, an interchangeable colour palette, excellent use of contrast continually, well-blended mixes of 2D and 3D animation, and movement. This film moves in a way where each background has some form of weather or signage or pedestrian traffic that makes it feel alive. And as far as I remember, it doesn't use that fucking frame hold technique that a lot of anime seems to use to cut down production time. That pisses me off no end. The sound design is equally great. I've already mentioned the excellent score, but each sound effect right down to the basic Foley work is nicely blended into each scene. And as sort of a side effect, the film's age gives each sound effect that nostalgic quality indicative in 90s animation. That thing that no one can ever really explain the sensation of, but you know it when it's there. I just hope you like spatializers and flange effects added to voice tracks, because that's going to happen a lot. Overall, the film is still a classic. There's no denying that. And while I can see where the people who think the movie is monotonous, dull, and overcomplicated for the sake of appearing smart are coming from, for me, it's still the film that, in tandem with Akira, introduced me to anime as a filmmaking art form. For me, it was a film ballsy enough to risk looking pretentious that succeeded in its task. It just wasn't very good at explaining why.